use that. I'll do it old-fashioned style. And I'm grateful to be here again. I was here at the last Resolve conference 18 months ago. I'm a little disappointed that Rachel did not introduce me with a song like she did with the people this morning. I would have thought even after she'd said it took 5 minutes in which to compose that song with AI that we could have come up with one over lunchtime. And thank you everyone for staying back for what is the graveyard shift, but networking will start immediately afterwards. This is a subject close to Linda's heart, I know, very close to my heart, and frankly it should be very close to everyone's heart here. Climate change means risk. Climate change means cost. Climate change is not a future matter. The climate invoices are here now and they are payable now. And it's something that we're going to be discussing during the course of our session this afternoon. They're payable reputationally, they're payable in what Tim referred to as the social licence setting, they're payable operationally, and operational changes are now going to be required immediately up and down the value chains, and they're payable, of course, financially. Double materiality is a concept of corporate reporting. It emphasises the need not only for companies to disclose how sustainability issues now, in addition to financial issues, affect them, but there's now going to be, under a series of reporting directives that have been adopted in various jurisdictions, requirements for companies themselves to go and take the next step and report on the due diligence procedures that they have brought to bear to deal not only with how sustainability issues are going to affect their businesses up and down the value chains, but how they are going to affect other companies, the environment at large, society at large, through their value chain activities. It is going to drag entities that are part of that supply chain into the climate space, even when they are not directly operating in those markets. Manjul is going to deal with that in much more detail in due course. But when I say that it's changing things financially and operationally, the insurance markets do already and will increasingly have a role to play in this space. Premium, coverage and risk have changed. They are already affecting the bottom line of businesses. They will continue to affect the bottom line of businesses because insurance companies are going to bear the brunt, or much of the brunt of the risk of the risk that is coming to pass with climate change and how it is going to operate on various different industries. We're also going to touch upon this afternoon, Rachel and Thomas will deal with the insurance point. We're also going to touch this afternoon on what I think has been referred to several times as the dark masters of the class actions, the climate funders. And we have Thomas here to represent the dark masters. It's a title that he's heard referred to several times today, and he's going to tell us why he takes great exception to that. So how have we ended up here? It was worthwhile, I thought, to go back to the beginning. All of us need to stop every now and again and take a pause on where we are and why we're here. It's hard to believe that United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is now 32 years old. We all get lost in the COP numbers, COP28, COP29. But 32 years ago, these were the laudable objectives. Ultimately, an objective to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that was going to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So far, so good as a laudable aspiration. But then the next statement, which I put up on the slide, which frankly, in today's age, grates when you read it, that it was going to be stabilised at a level and within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change. Apparently, if we did it more slowly, the Earth's ice sheets would melt less rapidly or not melt at all if we were going to deal with climate change in a particular time frame. It's remarkable to think that as an objective was actually enshrined in the convention all those years ago. As we know, it's passed through the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, the Glasgow commitments, ultimately to try to reach a point where there was an agreement on how high we were prepared to accept a word again I find grating, but prepared to accept how far we would go above pre-industrial levels of global warming. Not 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees. And well below 2 degrees at 1.5 degrees by capping greenhouse gas emissions in 2025 and then reducing them by 4.3% by 2030. This was so the United Nations Framework Convention says is all part of a legally binding agreement. Well, that depends on whether you've given effect to the treaty at a domestic level and how you've then put in place national laws to try to implement it. And in many jurisdictions around the world, that just hasn't happened. The German Constitutional Court back in 2021 set out what is probably a statement of the obvious. So far from being legally binding immediately by being a party to the treaty, it's a system based on mutual trust with a series of targets. And it was mutual trust because nowhere was there any agreement in the Paris Agreement about how parties were going to commit themselves to specific reduction measures. So where are we tracking? The two words, and this is not meant to be a climate talk, but it's sobering to pause and think why the climate bill is now in. I unashamedly borrow this from Professor Johan Rockström's climate talk, a TED talk that you'll find online in September 2024, only a few months ago, a tipping points on the Earth systems and where we're tracking. 2023 was the hottest year on record. 2024 is going to be hotter still. By 2022, we had passed 1.2 degrees increase above pre-industrial 1850 to 1900 levels. By 2023, we had already touched 1.45 degrees centigrade above those levels. We were already at the well below 1.5 degree level. And we're projected to actually pass through that this year. But most troubling in this curve, according to the climate scientists, is the steepness of the annual global mean average temperature increase. In the 4 decades up until 2014, that equated to 0.18 degrees centigrade per decade. In the last decade, that has shot up to 0.26 degrees. Given where we are now at, we are tracking to pass 2 degrees by 2045. Unless things change, we are tracking to be at 3 degrees by 2100. None of your grandchildren will look back on you in a favourable way if we reach at that point. And running with this has been an almost immediate correlation or similar correlation between any number of socio-economic behaviours of man and degradation to Earth systems that are necessary for climate sustainability. Population increase, loss of fresh water, putrefaction of fresh water with nitrogen and sulfate, loss of global rainforest coverage. This is where we are tracking now in the blue bar to 3 degrees, as I say. The pledges would keep it as 2 degrees on current trends. The 1.5 target looks like it's almost ancient history. And therein lies a problem, because what's happened over the last few years is that this has become almost an issue to be politically managed, not an issue to be confronted. As I say, we need to pause, we need to stop, we need to consider how we're going to address this. I said at the beginning that the climate invoice is in. I didn't do a slide on how much that was going to cost, because it depends on what study you read, and it depends on what you put into the climate science and climate economics model. How do you value population displacement? How do you value the health effects? How do you value, in the cases of countries, as we all know, like Tuvalu, that are going to lose their entire physical nation state, the loss of a culture? But the climate economists value this in $2050 at somewhere between, depending on the model, US $12 trillion per annum, upwards to US $38 trillion per annum in 2050 dollars. That last figure would represent its forecast an 18% impact on global GDP. I come to the next and last point of this overarching discussion. What about the second limb of what the German Constitutional Court said? What about mutual trust? That was meant to be the primary focus of COP29 last month in Azerbaijan. We were meant to have a position where there was an agreement, and we did get an agreement, at least, on global financing of the less developed countries. We all know how that ended up. Those countries came, the less developed countries, and that's a list of countries that were set in 1992, I hasten to add, came with a climate bill of $1.2 to $1.7 trillion. They walked away with $300 billion from 2035 onwards as a commitment. Putting that in perspective, that is 45 days of global defence spend, is the commitment that the remaining nations were prepared to make. And that to the most climate vulnerable and poorest countries in the world that are already overextended and overspending on mere loan repayments, as I've tried to highlight on this slide. So yes, within all of that, companies have to adapt. There is a litigation paradigm that goes to the reputational bill that I've been describing. Unless we're in the framework setting of national framework litigation, we've had some of that through the European Court of Human Rights in recent times, it is largely reputational and strategic. We'll address that in a moment with the panel. There's the compensatory climate change cases, which we'll also address with the panel and with discussions with Thomas. But there is now a bill. There is a bill to be paid, and there are now mechanisms that are now coming into play, and are coming into play this year through, amongst other things, these reporting directives that will require companies not just within Europe, not just within America or other jurisdictions where these directives have been adopted, but will require companies all the way through the supply chains to be paying those bills. And if I can invite the rest of the panel up now, we'll start that discussion.